Theme parks. Many people all over the world have fond, nostalgic memories involving theme parks. But unfortunately, from time to time, tragedy strikes unsuspecting theme park visitors. In the history of theme parks and amusement parks, there have been many fatal accidents. I mean, anytime you stick a bunch of humans on an extremely fast roller coaster, there are bound to be at least a couple terrible accidents. But in 2010, there was one theme park where a terrible, fatal event happened. But this did not involve a roller coaster, and this was no accident. This was a murder. This is the full story of Holy Land, USA. Our story takes place in Waterbury, Connecticut, a city with just around 100,000 people, and really no tourism industry to speak of. So this town may not seem like the ideal location to start a theme park, but that didn't stop Jonathan Greco from building a theme park there in the 1950s. John wasn't planning on making your average park. You see, a lot of theme parks in the 1950s were often themed after children's fairy tales. Some examples of smaller parks found in the 1950s are Children's Fairyland, founded in Oakland, California, or Paul Bunyan Land in Brainerd, Minnesota. While these types of theme parks are fun, John Greco wanted to make one that had meaning and purpose to him and his town. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he decided to make a Christian-themed park. But what does a Christian park even look like? Holy Land, USA did not really have any theme parks to model itself after. Since the opening of Holy Land, USA, there have been other Christian theme parks such as the Ark Encounter in Kentucky and the Holy Land Experience in Florida. However, Greco's Holy Land, USA was really the first Christian one to ever exist, at least as far as I can tell. John wanted his theme park to be a fun, positive place where he could share the history of his religion. When John was a young man, he decided he was going to be a priest. He even went to Catholic University in Washington, D.C., but he dropped out due to illness and lack of finances. Shortly after he dropped out, he applied and received a scholarship to Yale, and in 1926, he passed the bar exam and became a lawyer. Greco eventually set up his own full-time law practice out of Waterbury, Connecticut. Around the holidays in the 1940s, John and some of his friends would build nativity displays and set them up around Waterbury. This is where John first got the idea for a Christian theme park. He enjoyed creating the displays and thought it would be awesome if his town had a place where they could have similar but bigger displays all year round. He wouldn't get the chance to take action towards this idea until years later, well after World War II had ended. As terrible as World War II was, it actually financially helped many towns in America, and Waterbury was no exception. After the war ended, a lot of the jobs that had previously been there quickly dried up. Well, what happens when a town loses a large amount of jobs? People leave, and then real estate value plummets, which meant John could buy land for fairly cheap and finally get to work on this idea that he'd been brewing in his mind for so many years. So, in 1953, he bought 18 acres of undeveloped land. The land sat on a hill right in Waterbury, so anything on the hill could easily be seen by the townspeople below. But he wouldn't start developing the park until a couple years later. The very first thing that John built on his land was a 32-foot tall steel cross with neon lights attached to it. The cross would glow at night and could be seen by the entire town. John didn't stop there. He quickly began work on the rest of the park. He wanted to make small-scale replicas of places and events from Bible times. He studied maps and photographs, and even took a trip to Israel to get more inspiration for his park. With the help of volunteers, John used recycled and old donated building materials for most of the construction of the replicas. Greco led the building of the park while maintaining his full-time law practice. They built a Garden of Eden, a small replica of the catacombs, and several other places and events from the Bible. They also had a small library, chapel, and gift shop. There were over 125 miniature buildings that covered the 18-acre park. For what it was, a small theme park with no rides, it was actually kinda cool, and at its peak, it attracted over 40,000 visitors a year. There are several videos online saying that they think that all Christian theme parks are evil because they use people's belief in religion for financial gain, which in the case of some other Christian parks, you may be able to make that argument. But from everything I see online, Greco's Holy Land USA was completely free to get in. They did ask for a 50-cent parking donation per car, but let's say out of the 40,000 people per year, the parking lot saw 8,000 cars. That's an average of about 5 people per car, which I think is more than fair because Holy Land also hosted many school field trips which would have traveled by bus. So 8,000 cars is only bringing $4,000 per year, which if you factor in inflation today, that would only be around $37,000 per year, which would barely even be enough to upkeep a nearly 20-acre park year-round. They did have a small gift shop in the park, but I think it's pretty safe to say that financial gain from this park was not Greco's motivation at all. As mentioned earlier, he was a full-time lawyer, so this park was more of a passion project that Greco really cared about, not a scheme to become wealthy. I also found a quote from Jonathan Greco saying, "We don't try to convert anybody, we just show them what we believe." So I believe Jonathan Greco was just a man that wanted Christian families to have a fun Christian theme park that reflected their beliefs. For many years, the park ran smoothly and seemed to be well kept and well respected for the most part. The park constantly added exhibits throughout the 60s and even built a bigger glowing cross to replace the one built 10 years prior. The cross quickly became a local landmark, and it could be seen by many motorists on the nearby freeway. They also, at one point, added the white Holy Land USA sign that mimicked the iconic Hollywood sign. Unfortunately, the park would not see the same success in the mid and late 70s. At this point, Greco was in his mid-70s and could not keep up with everything the park needed. The Catholic Church assigned 2 nuns from the Religious Teachers Filippini to help John Greco upkeep the park, which did help some. But in 1974, the park was hit with a wildfire that would destroy several of the exhibits around the park. The misfortune would not stop there for the park. Shortly after the fire, vandals destroyed the park even further. By the late 70s, the park was completely different, and the attendance was only about half of what it once was. Just a few short years later, in 1984, the park would officially close. Greco was 88 years old and just could not keep up with the park activities at all. However, he did not want his vision to die. He wanted to re-innovate and rebuild the park. Apparently, Greco had the money to make the renovation happen. It was reported that he met with an architect just a short while before he passed. The proposed park renovation would cost over $10 million. John Greco died just a couple years after the park officially closed and left the park to the nuns of the Religious Teachers Filippini. I can only find this reported in 2 articles where the journalist apparently interviewed the nuns. Supposedly, Greco not only left them the park, but he left enough money to completely renovate it and keep it up for years and years. But an unnamed layman of the church was hired to head the project for the nuns, since they needed help planning this giant resurgence of the park. This is the quote from one of the nuns. "The money was pouring in, and then the man we hired to help us manage the finances, a layperson, absconded with all of the funds. We've been hurt many times, and nobody knows that sort of thing took place here. The man had helped rebuild another church, and we thought he could do the same thing for us. But something went wrong with him. I don't know." So, according to them, a man they previously trusted abused their trust and ran off with all of the funds that Greco had donated so that his dream could live on well after his death. So with the nuns growing older and having no funds, the park's fate was sealed. The park would continue to be abandoned and vandalized, and now is popular among urban explorers because its decayed Christian statues look extremely creepy because of the years of neglect. So how could our story get more dark and depressing than a con man stealing donation money from nuns? Well, nearly 30 years after the park closed, the most tragic part of the story happened. In 2010, a 16-year-old girl named Chloe Ottman was murdered right at the base of the cross at Holy Land, USA. This terrible crime, committed by 19-year-old Francisco Cruz, would unfortunately ruin any fond memories that the people of Waterbury might have had towards the religious theme park. A man's dream to share his beliefs through a fun exhibit had officially been turned into a dark nightmare. A few years after the terrible crime, a new cross was built at the location of the older one. In 2013, the property was sold to the mayor of Waterbury, Neil M. O'Leary, who plans on keeping the property and making it a place for meditation and prayer. So hopefully, no more disasters will happen to this park.